Well, I suppose, Cathaoirleach, it would come as no surprise to anybody who takes an interest in Irish political life that the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach spent a disproportionate amount of their time rawmashing about Sinn Féin. Of course, had they any confidence in their own actual budget and their own performance in government, they would have structured their remarks rather differently. But little wonder, because the budget comes at a time where we have a major crisis in housing, we have a crisis in health, and the soaring cost of living is writ large, impacting on the daily lives and aspirations of workers, families, and especially on our young people. So this should have been a housing budget, first and foremost. It should have been a budget to kickstart a transformation of our health service, and a budget to make life affordable again with ambitious action to cut living costs. But instead, the government and the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach aren't here. They do a lot to say, they talk a lot, listen very little, but they duck their responsibilities to make real and lasting differences in these areas. They essentially kicked for touch with an auction budget that does very little really to improve people's prospects in the long term. Now, of course, it's 13 years since a Fianna Fáil Minister for Finance introduced a budget, and we all know the reason for that hiatus. The party of the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, crashed the economy. Micheál Martin sat at Cabinet when government decimated public finances, drove the housing market off a cliff, and scattered our young people to the four corners of the globe in search of work and opportunity. So we will have to excuse us and those who suffered at their lack of good judgment and good governance if we take his homilies on economic prudence, prosperity and advancement with a very, very large dose of salt. They say that a week is a long time in politics. Well, 13 years is a lifetime. More than a decade to change and build a fairer, better and more equal Ireland. Budget 2024 is the fourth budget from this government, the eighth budget co-authored by Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, joined at the hip, and of course the 13th budget from Fine Gael since they came to power in 2011. And every one of those budgets represented a chance to deliver change, to put ordinary people first, and yet all we have ever gotten is more of the same. A budget in which ambition, imagination and vision are decidedly absent, recycling broken promises that created and embedded problems. And this budget is just the latest chapter in a story of failure written by parties and by a government devoid of ideas, out of touch with the challenges that face ordinary households, a government lacking in energy and now increasingly running out of time. We had a housing crisis before this budget, and we will have a housing crisis after this budget. Our health service was under enormous pressure before this budget. Our health service will be under even more pressure after this budget. Life for so many was unaffordable before this budget, and life will be unaffordable after it. I frequently remind the three men, one of whom only is here, who lead this government, that you came to office saying that you'd fix housing. That was your pledge. Well, if ever anyone needed proof as to why you should never, ever allow those who have created a problem to try and solve it, then the proof of this is in this budget. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have provided it in spades. People are crying out for affordable homes, to be able to put a secure roof over their heads. Hundreds of thousands of renters are ripped off every month. More than 12,000 people live in emergency accommodation. That includes almost 4,000 children who grow up without a place to call home. Sky-high house prices mean that so many of our younger generation are locked out of home ownership. They look, therefore, for a better life, a better chance in Boston and Toronto and Perth, far away from their families, from their friends, and from their communities. And the housing crisis has now literally seeped into every facet of our society and our economy. And it's little wonder that employers struggle to hire workers, hospitals struggle to hire nurses, schools struggle to hire teachers. And yet the Taoiseach claims that the government housing plan is working. And yet on the watch of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, housing has gone from crisis to emergency to full-blown social disaster. So if this is your definition of success, God help us should we ever see your failures. If you look at the budget announced yesterday by Ministers McGrath and Donoghue, you'd think that housing wasn't an issue at all. You'd imagine that everything was rosy in the biodiverse garden. Nothing to see here, move on. Well, the reality is that those caught up in this housing disaster can't move on. They're stuck, unable to get a mortgage, trapped in the nightmare of the private rental sector, and more adults than ever find themselves unable to move out of the family home. Last night I listened to one young man in his 20s talk about how at his age his parents were married, had a home, and they had 2 kids. But for him, his life is on hold. And this budget should have been, could have been, about changing things for that young man and for his generation. It was an opportunity to change direction, an opportunity to provide the necessary investment for a massive scaling up in the delivery of affordable and social homes that people need, an opportunity to act decisively to finally tackle extortionate rents. But you have all chosen to squander that opportunity. Incredibly, you have not provided a single cent of additional capital funding for affordable and social housing when the situation gets worse and worse by the day. Budget 23 last year provided €2.6 billion in exchequer capital for housing. Budget 24 provides exactly the same. No ramping up of targets that were already too low, and well you know it. No ban on soaring rent increases. And incredibly, you're doing nearly twice as much for landlords as you're doing for renters. Another big transfer of public money into the coffers of landlords is not the big idea needed to address the dysfunctional and exploitative private rental sector. So there simply are no excuses anymore. There are no excuses for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael anymore in housing. The longer they have been in government, the worse housing has become. And renters and aspiring homeowners will be stunned that there was no increase in capital spending, no new targets, despite government having the money to make a decisive intervention. There's no real determination, you see, to get to grips with this crisis. Frankly, at this stage, your government is negligent and reckless, not to say incompetent. And those in desperate need of housing will today scratch their heads in frustration and ask, where's the urgency? Where's the pace? Where's the ambition to fix housing? Because they won't find it in this budget. A Sinn Féin government would be different. That's true. The Taoiseach and Taoiseach commented on that. Absolutely different. We would introduce a housing budget, a defining budget for our times. We would deliver the investment to drive the biggest house building programme in the history of the state. For this budget, we proposed an additional investment of €1.7 billion to deliver 21,000 affordable and social homes, way above the government's target. But that's the scale of ambition and more that will be required to fix housing. But your government doesn't get it. It seems to me you don't want to get it, quite frankly, at this stage. It's laughable that Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil claim to be the parties of home ownership without ever bringing forward a credible state-led plan for affordable housing. So the gloves need to come off now when it comes to tackling and ending the housing crisis. But once again, this government has failed to land a punch. In this budget, you have also confirmed beyond doubt that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael-led governments are bad for the health of ordinary workers and families. You certainly threw Minister Donnelly under the bus, didn't you? Astonishing, there wasn't one mention of health in the Taoiseach's very, very long, very expansive speech. Not a mention of health. Not an additional cent for new hospital beds. And the Minister's big promise of 1,500 additional beds was torn up. Perhaps was it in punishment for the massive cost overruns that now plague the health service? You've allocated even less than last year simply for the system to stand still, and the capital budget will be outstripped by inflation. So just remember this though, whatever the internal dynamics of this government, whatever the views and rivalries, remember it's not Minister Donnelly who'll feel the pain of all of this. It's the hundreds of thousands of people waiting just to get a hospital appointment. It's the children living in agony as they wait for life-changing spinal procedures. It's older people, sick people, left on trolleys in overcrowded and unsafe hospital corridors. You wouldn't think either that we have a recruitment and retention crisis across the health service, from GPs to doctors and nurses, speech and language therapists, all forms of specialists. Because you have to ask yourself, where's the funding for an action plan to solve this? Where is it, gentlemen? €100 million for new measures is a drop in the ocean. And it is no surprise to us that a senior government source is quoted in the media today saying health was not a priority in this budget. That much is very, very obvious. For our part, we proposed an investment of €1.3 billion, which would deliver 1,800 additional hospital beds over 3 years, expand theatre and diagnostic capacity, deliver more home care, and expand training places for healthcare professionals. Now that's a plan. That's what a plan looks like. This would help ensure that people receive the right care in the right place at the right time. Your health budget demonstrates that government has thrown in the towel on solving the health crisis. It's bad for our health, bad for patients, and bad for frontline workers. And your failure to invest means that the crisis in our health service will continue, chronic waiting lists will continue, overcrowding will continue. That's certainly the case for University Hospital Limerick, a hospital that has experienced the most serious overcrowding on record, and where more people are being advised to stay away from the emergency department. This failure extends into services for some of the most vulnerable people in our society, and it's cruelly ironic that the budget was introduced on World Mental Health Day, because the allocation in this area is truly shameful. We have a mental health crisis. Young people, families, communities crying out for services, resources and help. They would have been looking on yesterday, hoping that this help would come from government. But if there is any new mental health funding, it is buried in a paltry allocation of €7.5 million, spread across several sectors. So what do you say to those young people and their parents suffering because CAMHS is on its knees and getting worse? To those who age out of the system at 18 years while they're still in need of treatment and care? And I put it to you, Taoiseach and Taoiseach, if you were here, that it's very dangerous for the government to pay lip service to the area of mental health and not to deliver the funding and resources necessary to achieve the radical overhaul required. That's why Sinn Féin outlined that mental health services required an investment of more than €70 million next year. You see, we need ambition and energy to deliver a world-class, modern, fit-for-purpose mental health system in Ireland. Treading water, skirting around the edges of the problem will not get the job done. Those living with mental health challenges will feel abandoned and very badly let down by your government today. Taoiseach Taoiseach in abstentia, a real sign of the lack of fairness that is hardwired into this budget is found in the area of disability, and I think Minister Ryan raised this particular area. So let me just tell you that since yesterday afternoon, we have heard countless voices of people living with disabilities and their families and carers, and they have expressed a clear sense of abandonment, of being let down, of being forgotten, being left out in the cold. Not enough has been done to protect people living with disabilities at risk of poverty. The allocation provided needed to go much further to deliver on the government's own capacity review. And there's no guarantee that pay inequality will be addressed for workers in the sector, critical to the quality of life of those living with disabilities. So, can people living with disabilities be given clarity? Will the cost of living package they got last year be delivered again this year? What is the actual funding for the provision of new services, or is there any? And what action will government take to meet the demands of Section 39 workers, as services are now on the brink of strike action? The cost of living crisis continues as workers and families are hammered by soaring bills in every area. But instead of bringing down the cost of fuel, incredibly, you decided to increase the cost of petrol and diesel at the pumps last night. So this will make it even more difficult for families to get out and about to work, to school, and to go about the business of life. It will be especially hard for those living in rural towns and villages who cannot rely on public transport. So it seems to me, for all the talk, you are hell-bent on penalising people. And you never seem to stand back to realise that in order to make this just transition, you need to enable and encourage people to make a change by providing them with options, better transport options. But you keep beating the same drum, keep following the same failed plan, and you keep expecting different results. It's a cul-de-sac that you are in that will not yield success or progress at the pace that we need it. I welcome the fact that Sinn Féin managed to move you on mortgage relief. It certainly was not easy. We had months and months of resistance from both Ministers McGrath and Donoghue, to my colleague Pearse Doherty. But yet it beggars belief that you've managed to take a good proposal and make an absolute hames of it by excluding hundreds and thousands of homeowners who have seen big increases in their mortgage repayments. Families, by the way, Minister Ryan, are still forking out a fortune for childcare fees. You have brought forward a proposed cut of 25%. It's a great headline, but parents will be baffled that this cut doesn't kick in until next September. That's almost a year away. Parents are under pressure with childcare costs today, now. And I think it's a real sly political sleight of hand that you've delivered, and parents cannot afford to wait another 11 months for the relief that they so badly need. The climate crisis is very real and it's immediate, and it demands visionary measures and plans from governments right across the world. In our alternative budget, we've set out ambitious plans to significantly ramp up investment in climate action. Yet the government, for all its big talk, has come up with very meagre allocations right across the board. We proposed a core capital increase 4 times bigger than the increase allocated by government yesterday. Budget 2024 cements this government's woeful lack of leadership and delivery on climate change. We proposed a radical overhaul of the national retrofit programme that would make retrofitting of homes actually available and actually affordable to ordinary, regular households. In contrast, government has chosen to double down on a deep retrofit scheme that can only be accessed by those who happen to have thousands of euros at their disposal. It completely leaves out those who do not have access to that kind of money, who might be living in older, more energy inefficient homes, and who need all their income simply to make it to the end of the month. The government scheme is so lacking in basic common sense that, frankly, it defies reason. It's almost as if government is trying to make climate action a luxury that only the very well-off can afford. I have said repeatedly, and I think we are all in agreement, that Ireland can achieve energy independence by harnessing our abundance of renewable energy resources, particularly wind, and particularly on the West Coast. Such an achievement would utterly transform our economy, create the green jobs of the future, and ensure that Ireland becomes an international hub of clean energy. But where in this budget is the investment to make that vision a reality? To deliver a fit-for-purpose planning system, to drive efficiency, to get renewable energy projects off the ground, to develop our ports and grid infrastructure to levels needed in order to realise this immense opportunity. Again, no vision, no ambition, no pace. When Leo Varadkar returned to the office of An Taoiseach in December of last year, he said that tackling child poverty would be one of his main priorities. Well, the ministers who wrote this budget must not have received that memo. There is very little recognition here that the cost of raising a child has skyrocketed, leaving many families at the risk of poverty. The qualified child payment will be increased by only €4 per week, far below what the Children's Rights Alliance and many other organisations had said would be the minimum requirement. In addition, there's no increase for the core rate of child benefit. It is still below the 2008 rate, which was cut, remember, by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments, and no increase has been made since 2016. Families are under savage pressure, and the core rate really did need to be increased. I do welcome the extension of child benefit to 18-year-olds in further education, but let's face it, much more was needed. You see, it's not enough to talk about tackling child poverty. You actually have to act decisively to make a real difference. Promises made and promises broken only serve to compound the problem. I raised with the Taoiseach last week the government's woeful handling of the nitrates derogation. The changes will place huge financial pressure on farmers who made a real effort to implement measures to improve water quality, only to have the rug pulled from under them. We still haven't been told when the Taoiseach will meet with the EU Commissioner. And I want to remind and place on the record of the Dáil that the commitment made by the Taoiseach to farmers was that this meeting, when it happens, was about maintaining the nitrates derogation in full, in the here and now. It wasn't a commitment about some renewed effort at a future date. When I put this matter to the Taoiseach last week, he changed his position on this. I want to say, in changing that position, the Taoiseach is breaking his promise to farming organisations. And just like the agriculture measures in this budget, the Taoiseach was big on rhetoric, but wholly inadequate in terms of delivering for family farmers and the rural communities that depend on them. On social media yesterday, government made a really big play on the tax cuts it's delivered. Fine Gael were all out to convince working people that this is just great for them. What they didn't tell people is that your tax plan benefits those at the top far more than ordinary workers and families. The tax package delivered by government yesterday would benefit somebody earning over €200,000 by more than €890, while someone earning €35,000 would benefit by just €320. So where is the fairness and equity in that? And so when you say that you're putting money back into people's pockets, you are making sure that the most well-off are getting a bigger share of the pie once again. And if anything sums up the utter madness of your tax measures, it's that this budget provided more for landlords than it did for renters. So now, a nurse will be taxed more than a landlord. I want someone to explain to me how that is fair. I want them to explain how that would encourage nurses to stay working in our health service. The absence of fairness and equality continues. Cathaoirleach, Budget 2024 is the budget straight out of the playbook of parties wedded to failure. This government, led by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, is jaded and out of ideas, so locked into the past that they're standing by, refusing to seize big opportunities for Ireland, and their lack of vision is off the charts. We recall that when the policies of the last Fianna Fáil government pushed the state to financial and economic disaster, it was workers and families who picked up the tab. It was workers and families who carried the burden of Fine Gael-inflicted cuts and austerity in the years that followed. And the mantra from these parties was that tough decisions had to be made, and somehow it was always ordinary people who took the hit when these very tough decisions were implemented. The message from Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil during those times was that people would have to wait for recovery to see the necessary improvements in housing and health and the provision of public services. So now here we are, at a time of record surpluses, and the message is again to wait, to wait, to wait. Time and again, we hear it from government ministers. You tell us that the housing crisis couldn't be fixed overnight when you've had more than a decade. You repeatedly promised to end the scandal of overcrowded hospitals, and then you refuse to provide the essential resources and investment. And today you have the money to make a difference, and you're still unable to get the job done. So I think the penny has dropped for more and more people. The bad choices made by governments in successive budgets are why an entire generation is locked out of opportunity and prosperity, locked out of home ownership, an entire generation worse off than their parents. For generations, you see, people rightly expected that if you got a job and worked hard, you could get ahead, build a happy and secure life for yourself and your family. But this expectation has now been shredded by successive Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments. Ordinary people wake up every morning and see that the Ireland shaped by these parties doesn't work for them. But it doesn't have to be this way, because our country is bursting with talent, with ideas, with energy, and we have everything that we need to renew the social contract and build a fairer, stronger Ireland. We need a new government that will break the cycle of these stagnant budgets. You see, the most prudent use of public finances, the most fiscally responsible thing to do now is to invest in our country, in our public infrastructure, to drive economic growth, to back our people in taking Ireland to the next level. Ba ceart cá náis tíochta a bhí ann, ba ceart ag an rialtas in eisteocht a bhéadú agus sprochanna chun tíocht so síalta phrais réasúnta a chur fáil. Faoi rialtas Sinn Féin curthaí an con a snéis se tús leis an glór tíochta is mó sa stát dá wachamid riamh. Cathaoirleach, the appetite for real change amongst ordinary people grows by the day, and despite the challenges we face, this appetite for change is fuelled by the hopeful belief that our best days are yet to come, that if we reach bravely for tomorrow and push beyond the boundaries of the past, there is no limit to our bright future. And I want everyone who feels abandoned, let down and left behind by these budgets to know that we in Sinn Féin see you, we hear you, and we're working hard to change things for you. This budget demonstrates again that it is in fact government inertia, government apathy, government lethargy, that claustrophobic fixation with doing the same things over and over again. That is what presents the big threat to Ireland's future. Change is not only desirable, change is now essential. This budget shows once again that while change is beyond Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, change remains within the grasp of our people. It was this failed government's fourth budget, and ordinary workers and families simply cannot afford a fifth. Your government is out of touch, out of ideas and out of time. Sinn Féin is the party that wants to end the housing crisis, that will end the housing crisis. We will fix housing. We will make housing affordable again. We will deliver for a generation that has been held back, denied their chance of a good life and a decent future by the stifling politics of parties that have passed power between them for over a century. Cathaoirleach, we need a general election and a government for change that will put workers and families first. Nobody left out, nobody left behind. Now that's a vision of Ireland worth believing in, worth working for and worth achieving.
Thank you, Deputy.